In November of 1939, Stalin gave a simple order: invade Finland. The Soviet Union had over 400,000 soldiers on the Finnish border. It had thousands of tanks. It had hundreds of aircraft and the largest standing army on Earth. Stalin expected the war to last 2 weeks. Finland was a nation of 3 million people. Its soldiers were farmers and foresters, called up on short notice. It had almost no tanks. Its air force was outmatched from the very first hour. On paper, there was no contest. What followed was 105 days that stunned the world. A small nation held off a superpower. A farmer's army bled the Red Army in frozen forests no Soviet general had ever studied. Finland did not win the Winter War. It lost land. It signed a painful peace. Yet in surviving, Finland sent a signal. That signal reached Berlin. One man read it entirely wrong. That misreading would kill millions. This is the story of Finland's Winter War. It is also the story of a miscalculation, one that changed the course of the entire Second World War. Understand the Winter War, you must first understand Europe. In the autumn of 1939, Germany had invaded Poland on the 1st of September. Britain and France had declared war. The continent was already burning for the second time in 25 years. Stalin watched carefully. He had signed a non-aggression pact with Hitler that August. It bought him time. It also included a secret protocol, one that divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Finland fell into the Soviet sphere. The Soviet Union had specific fears about Finland. Leningrad, its second largest city, sat only 32 kilometers from the Finnish border. Any enemy using Finnish land could threaten Leningrad directly. Stalin wanted buffer space. He wanted the Karelian Isthmus, not all of Finland, but the land closest to the city. He offered territory elsewhere in exchange. He believed the Finns would accept. Finland sent its chief negotiator, Paasikivi, to Moscow in October. The talks were serious. Paasikivi understood the Soviet position clearly. He understood what Finland risked by refusing. The talks failed. Finland would not surrender the Karelian Isthmus. To do so, the Finnish government believed, was to surrender the ability to defend the country at all. Paasikivi returned home without an agreement. On the 26th of November, Soviet artillery fired on their own border village of Mainila. Moscow blamed Finland. The accusation was almost certainly false. The shells had come from the Soviet side, but it gave Stalin the pretext he needed. 4 days later, the invasion began. The border that had stood for 20 years was crossed before dawn. The Red Army of 1939 was, on paper, the most powerful land force on Earth. It had over 1 million men in uniform. It had more than 12,000 tanks. It had artillery in quantities that made Finnish planners pale with dread. The force assigned to Finland was smaller, still enormous. 450,000 soldiers, 2,000 tanks, nearly 800 aircraft. Against this stood Finland. Finland had mobilized roughly 300,000 men. Most were reservists, farmers, foresters, and factory workers called up in the weeks before the invasion. Their equipment was aging. Their artillery was limited. They had almost no tanks. What Finland had was something harder to count. Its soldiers knew the terrain: every frozen lake, every narrow forest road, every killing ground between the trees. They had trained for winter warfare in cold that would stop a Soviet column dead. Finland also had Mannerheim. Field Marshal Mannerheim, the architect of Finland's entire defense, was 62 years old when the war began. He had fought in the Russo-Japanese War. He had served the Tsar. He understood the Russian military mind. He knew its strengths. More importantly, he knew its weaknesses. For years, Mannerheim had been building a defensive line across the Karelian Isthmus. It ran from the Gulf of Finland to the shore of Lake Ladoga, a chain of fortifications, tank traps, and prepared positions. His soldiers called it the Mannerheim Line. It was not impenetrable. It was not the greatest fortification ever built, but Finland's soldiers knew every meter of it, and that, Mannerheim believed, would matter more than numbers. Stalin's plan for the invasion was built on contempt. He assigned the campaign to the Leningrad military district. Its commander, General Meretskov, was told the war would last 2 weeks. The Red Army would advance on multiple fronts simultaneously. Finnish defenses would collapse under weight and pressure. No serious study of Finnish terrain had been done. No cold weather training had been ordered. The planners assumed none of it would be necessary. Finland's planning was built on something entirely different. Mannerheim had no illusions about the outcome of a conventional war. Finland could not outfight the Soviet Union in open battle. His goal was not to win. His goal was to hold long enough for outside pressure to force a negotiated settlement. Every decision he made flowed from that single calculation. On the Karelian Isthmus, Finnish forces would fight from the prepared positions of the Mannerheim Line. They would trade ground slowly. They would make the Soviets pay for every kilometer in blood and time. In the vast forests to the north, the approach was different. Finnish units would not hold fixed lines. They would move through the trees on skis. They would attack Soviet supply columns from the flanks. They would cut roads and disappear before a counterattack could find them. The Finnish soldier wore white. He carried skis. He could move through a blizzard that stopped a Soviet armored column completely. Stalin had planned a 2-week war. Finland had prepared for a campaign that might last the entire winter. The Finnish army did not plan to defeat the Soviet Union. It planned to make victory cost more than Moscow was willing to spend. That distinction was the core of everything that followed. At 7 o'clock in the morning on the 30th of November, Soviet forces crossed the Finnish border. The advance came on 6 axes simultaneously. The intent was to overwhelm Finland's ability to respond. Too many fronts, too much pressure. No single point where Finnish forces could concentrate. Soviet artillery opened fire along the Karelian Isthmus. Aircraft bombed Helsinki within hours. The world was watching. Finland appealed to the League of Nations. The League acted with unusual speed. It expelled the Soviet Union, one of the few decisive actions in its entire history. The expulsion changed nothing on the ground. Soviet columns kept advancing, but the ground itself was pushing back. The forests of eastern Finland had no roads. They had frozen lakes, dense tree lines, and narrow tracks between them. A Red Army built for open terrain found itself channeled into corridors it could not leave. Finnish ski units appeared from the trees without warning. They struck supply columns. They cut roads ahead and behind. Then they vanished. A Soviet column cut off from its supply line in minus 40 degrees was not a fighting force. It was a queue of men slowly dying. The Soviets called these encirclements mati, the Finnish word for a cubic meter of firewood. The name was fitting. Each surrounded column was cut into sections. Each section was left to freeze or fight its way out. Most did neither. By December, the Soviet advance had stalled on almost every front. The Mannerheim Line had not broken. The forest battles had turned catastrophic. Stalin's 2-week war had already lasted longer than any planner had allowed for. Something had gone badly wrong. The question was whether anyone in Moscow was willing to say so. December of 1939 became a catastrophe for the Red Army. The worst single disaster unfolded near Suomussalmi, a small village in central Finland that no Soviet planner had considered significant. 2 full Soviet divisions were assigned to advance through Suomussalmi toward the Gulf of Bothnia. Their goal was to cut Finland in half. The 163rd Division arrived first. Finnish forces under Colonel Siilasvuo surrounded it immediately. The Soviets could not maneuver. They could not receive supplies. They dug in and waited for the 44th Division to relieve them. The 44th Division arrived too late. It advanced on a single forest road, stretched across 30 kilometers of frozen wilderness. Siilasvuo's men hit it from both flanks simultaneously. They cut it into isolated pockets. They destroyed each pocket in sequence. Both divisions were annihilated. The 44th Division alone lost approximately 27,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. Its commander was court-martialed on the spot. He was taken into the forest. He was shot. Across the entire front, the pattern repeated. Soviet units advanced into terrain they had never studied. Finnish ski troops materialized, struck, and disappeared before a response could form. Supply lines collapsed. Men froze in temperatures that no Soviet planner had prepared for. Soviet tanks, advancing without infantry support, were destroyed one by one. Finnish soldiers used improvised weapons bottles filled with fuel, lit and thrown at engine vents. The soldiers gave these bottles a name. They called them Molotov cocktails, a bitter joke at the expense of the Soviet foreign minister who had publicly described the bombing of Finnish cities as humanitarian food drops. The name spread beyond Finland, beyond the war, beyond the century. By the end of December, the Red Army had suffered catastrophic losses for almost no territorial gain. 45 days of war had produced broken columns, frozen dead, and a front that had barely moved. Stalin responded. He sacked Moretskov. He appointed General Timoshenko in his place, one of the most capable officers the Soviet military possessed. Timoshenko was given 2 months to prepare a new offensive. He used every day. Timoshenko did not repeat December's mistakes. He did something more dangerous. He stopped. For 6 weeks, he halted offensive operations entirely. He reorganized his forces from the ground up. He brought in heavy siege artillery, not the field pieces used in December, but guns capable of destroying reinforced concrete. He trained his infantry to work alongside tanks. He trained his armored crews to work alongside infantry. He drilled coordination into units that had advanced in isolation before. The preparation was meticulous. It was also visible from the Finnish side. Mannerheim watched. He knew what was coming. His army had been fighting for 40 days. His reserves were stretched. His ammunition supply was tightening. The new Soviet offensive began on the 1st of February 1940. The difference was immediate. Soviet artillery struck the Mannerheim line in a bombardment that lasted for days before any infantry moved. Hundreds of guns, thousands of shells per hour. The concrete held. The men behind it did not. Finnish defenders were killed, buried, and broken by sheer volume of fire. When Soviet infantry finally advanced, they moved methodically, engineers clearing obstacles, tanks following, infantry protecting the tanks. If one line of approach failed, the next was tried at once. On the 11th of February, the Mannerheim line cracked. Finnish reserves were committed immediately. The line held for a few more days. Then it broke entirely. Finnish forces fell back to a second defensive position. Soviet pressure continued without pause. The second line held for days. Then it too began to fail. Mannerheim sent a report to Helsinki. He did not soften it. His army was exhausted. It had fought without adequate rest for over 70 days. Ammunition was running critically low. Replacements were insufficient. The army could hold for perhaps 3 more weeks. It could not hold longer than that. Finland needed to end the war, on whatever terms it could obtain. Finland opened peace negotiations in early March. The talks moved quickly. Finland had almost no leverage left. The only card it held was the cost of continued fighting, and that cost was falling with every kilometer of Soviet advance. On the 12th of March, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. Finland ceded the Karelian Isthmus. It surrendered Viipuri, its second largest city. It gave up the Ribachi Peninsula in the far north. In total, Finland lost approximately 11% of its territory. 400,000 Finnish civilians had to be relocated inside the new borders. They left in days. Entire communities packed what they could carry and walked away from land their families had farmed for generations. The evacuations were completed before Soviet forces arrived to take possession. Not a single Finnish civilian was left behind for the Soviets to claim. The Soviet Union received exactly what it had originally requested in the autumn of 1939. The buffer it wanted, the border distance it needed. It had paid an extraordinary price to obtain it. In Britain and France, the reaction was brief. The Finnish resistance had been followed with intense public admiration. Plans for expeditionary forces had been discussed in both governments. Those plans had come to nothing. The war ended before help could arrive. Germany watched with different eyes. Hitler had followed the Winter War with close attention. What he saw was a Red Army that had struggled for 105 days against a nation of 3 million people. He saw an officer corps paralyzed by fear, men who could not act independently, who waited for orders that sometimes arrived too late or not at all. He saw the wreckage of Stalin's military purges. Thousands of experienced officers had been executed or imprisoned in the late 1930s. The army that invaded Finland was led, in many cases, by men promoted far beyond their ability. Hitler drew a conclusion. He drew it with complete confidence. The Soviet military was hollow. One decisive blow would shatter it. Germany could defeat the Soviet Union before winter. That conclusion would become the foundation of the largest military invasion in human history. The numbers from the Winter War resist easy comprehension. Finnish casualties totaled approximately 25,000 dead in 105 days, nearly 240 men every single day for the entire length of the war. Soviet losses were far higher. Records that emerged after the Cold War suggested around 125,000 dead, with perhaps 300,000 wounded. Some historians place the true figure considerably higher. The cold itself claimed lives that no casualty report recorded accurately. These numbers do not include the men who froze without reaching a field hospital. They do not include the Finnish civilians who lost their homes in the evacuations. They do not count the Soviet soldiers captured and held for years in Finnish camps, far from any life they had known. The war had a human face that Finland has never forgotten. His name was Hiha, a Finnish farmer and marksman from the south. He was called up when the war began. He was assigned to the forest front on the Karelian Isthmus. He fought with a bolt-action rifle and iron sights no scope. He said a scope raised your head too high above cover. The Soviet command eventually assigned special units to find him. Counter-snipers were sent. Artillery was directed at areas where he had last been observed. He survived every attempt. In fewer than 100 days of combat, Hiha killed more than 500 Soviet soldiers. On the 6th of March, 1940, a Soviet bullet struck him in the jaw. He survived. He was evacuated from the line. The war ended 6 days later. He returned to farming after the war. He lived until 2002. In his final years, when journalists asked about his wartime record, Hiha gave the same answer each time. He said he had done his duty. He said nothing more. The Winter War ended on the 12th of March, 1940. Finland had survived as an independent nation. That was not inevitable. Stalin had established a puppet Finnish government in the first days of the invasion. A provisional administration ready to be installed the moment Soviet forces reached Helsinki. The forces never reached Helsinki. The puppet government was quietly dissolved. It left almost no trace in Soviet records. Finland kept its independence, it kept its democracy. It paid for both with land and blood. The Soviet Union received its buffer. It lost something harder to recover, its reputation as a military power. Neutral nations had watched the Winter War with attention. The spectacle of the world's largest army, struggling for over 3 months against 3 million people, was not easily explained away. In June of 1941, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa. Finland joined the offensive separately, seeking to recover the Karelian territories it had lost. Finnish leadership called it the Continuation War. It was not, they insisted, a German alliance. It was a Finnish war with a German coincidence of timing. The distinction mattered to Finland. It mattered less to the broader course of events. Finland recovered its lost territories in 1941. It lost them again in 1944. The final border settled close to where it had been drawn in March of 1940. But the most consequential legacy of the Winter War was never finished. Hitler had watched 105 days of Soviet military failure and drawn a conclusion he never revised. The Red Army was broken. Its officer corps was gutted. A fast, decisive German strike would cause it to collapse before it could recover. He was wrong. Not about what had happened in Finland, the failures were real. He was wrong about what those failures meant. The Soviet military that struggled in December of 1939 was not the military that would fight at Stalingrad. Timoshenko's reorganization in February of 1940 was not a temporary fix. It was the beginning of a transformation. The Red Army learned from catastrophic failure with a speed and ruthlessness that had no parallel in the history of modern warfare. Hitler did not see the learning. He saw only the stumbling. Operation Barbarossa began on the 22nd of June, 1941. It was built, in part, on a confidence that Finland had placed in his mind. 27 million Soviet citizens would die in the war that followed. A small country's extraordinary defense, fought with courage no one disputed and sacrifice no one doubted, contributed, in ways no Finnish soldier ever intended, to the conditions that made the largest catastrophe of the 20th century possible. History does not sort its debts by who deserves them. The bravest stand in the smallest war can open the door to the largest one. If this is the kind of story that refuses to leave you, the kind that reveals how fragile the distance between survival and catastrophe truly is, subscribe to Crown and Ruin. Every week, we bring you the histories that shaped the world we inherited, the stories that explain why things are the way they are.